Imagine you tried to turn on your faucet and nothing came out. Here in first world countries, we tend to take for granted indoor plumbing and water on demand, but water is absolutely essential in survival. And once you don't have it, you quickly begin to realize how important it actually is. So whether you're talking about a large-scale cyber attack, man-made disasters, or even just simple water disruptions, you're bound to experience life without water at one point or another, and most of you probably already have. I know I have a few times. Today, I want to discuss some different water storage containers, how much you might need, and how to store water properly for these emergencies. Also, in a little bit, I want to go over what I've been doing or what I've been trying to do with my well to have an unlimited water supply, and also what you might be able to do if you don't have a well. But first, I want to go over the basics, and I know quite a few of you are sort of past this point, but I want to make sure and cover everything. I put timestamps in this video, that way if there is something that you already know, you can skip forward and go to the parts that you don't. And to start off, let's briefly go over what you would need this emergency water storage for. It's not just the drinking water, it's not just for yourself, although that is the most important part. It's also important for medical reasons, whether you're sterilizing equipment, you're keeping people hydrated. There are a lot of different situations where water is going to be important. You've also got cooking, which is something a lot of people don't really think about when they're putting together their food storage. You've got all these different meal options, but you're going to have to be able to make those, and a lot of those will require water. And then you've also got sanitation and hygiene, cleaning yourself, cleaning your home, making sure the illness prevention, making sure nobody's going to get sick from the trash buildup and things not being the way they are normally. So there are a lot of situations where you're going to need water that doesn't necessarily mean just drinking it, although that is what the majority of it is going to be used for. And as far as how much you need to store, the CDC recommends, and you've probably heard this recommendation, 1 gallon of water per person per day. And that will get you by just barely, I think. I recommend at least 2 gallons of water per person per day. The average person, and this depends on a number of different factors, your age, your health, your size, your physical activity, but the average person needs around 3 quarts to a gallon of liquids per day. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean all water. There's water in food, there's water in things that we consume on a daily basis that we end up getting to that point. Most of us probably don't drink a gallon of water per day, but that is the recommended amount. Now, in an emergency or survival situation, yes, you're going to be able to get away with a little bit of that, but a gallon a day is optimal. So that 1 gallon of water storage, you can see right there, there's very little left over for the other things. So that's why I recommend 2 gallons of water per person per day, and you'll have a little bit extra to draw on and not have to worry so much about rationing and how much you're using. Now, as far as how you might be affected in a power outage, really is different for everyone. Out here, we are on well water. So that means when the power is out, the well is out, which means I've got a couple of flushes, maybe a shower's worth of water in the pressure tank. I believe ours is like 30 gallons. And the hot water tank, which is about 50 gallons. So when the grid goes down, there's a very limited supply. And that's what I'm working on a solution for. If you live in the city, the odds are that there are pumping stations and it is going to require electricity. You could be one of the lucky ones where you have the water tower and it's gravity fed into your home. Those are far and few between these days. Even if you have one of those water towers near your home, that could be just to equalize things, equalize the water pressure, and not necessarily gravity fed into your home. If you live in an apartment, the chances are that you're not going to have running water because it requires electricity to pump that water up to you. So it really is dependent on your situation, but the odds are, I think, when the electricity is out, you're going to be in the same boat as me, basically, and have a limited water supply. So we need to have some water storage solutions, and that's what I want to go into next. We'll start off with the containers and then some of the best practices towards the end, but With containers, there really are a lot of options. You've got the smallest and the easiest option, which is 2-liter water bottles, bottles that have been previously used to store liquids, consumable liquids in. Something that has not been used for toxic substances. So you've got the Arizona iced tea containers, you've got 2-liter water bottles, you've got the plastic water bottles, the cases of water bottles, right? The PETE water bottles, which is a type of clear or colored plastic they use to make these containers that all of these liquids are in. And this is the easiest method because you basically just fill those up, figure out where you're going to store those. You don't necessarily need to treat them because you can just dump them out in 6 to 8 months and refill them. Although if you are going to store them for, years, I would think about treating those. And also, after I talk about these containers, I'll go over the difference between city water that's been pre-treated before it even comes out of your faucet and well water, which needs to be treated, or water that you may find. So like I said, these containers like the 2-liter water bottles or the Arizona iced tea jugs are great for storing water. I wouldn't use the thinner containers like plastic milk jugs because those will just break down over time. Those are not meant to be stored for longer term. You can feel the difference in thickness between a milk jug and a 2-liter water bottle fairly easily, and it's going to be better for storage. So I wouldn't use milk jugs or anything like that. And then you've got the HDPE, which is high density polyurethane containers. These are the larger containers that they range from 5 gallons up to the really large containers, the water storage tanks that can store hundreds of gallons. But some of these smaller ones, and by smaller, I mean 5 gallons or so, some of these smaller ones I think are a better option than the 2-liter water bottles or those PETE containers because you're going to be able to store more in a smaller space. I've got about 100 gallons of water stored in my basement in my closet, and 100 gallons in these containers takes up quite a bit less space than, say, if I had 100 gallons of just the water bottles or even 2-liter water bottles. And the 5-gallon size is a pretty good size because it can be moved around. You get above 5 gallons and it can be challenging depending on the person, their age. It can be challenging to move those around. So I think the 5-gallon containers are the sweet spot as far as portability for these water containers. Now, as far as the really large water storage tanks, if you live in a climate that doesn't get too hot or doesn't get too cold, you could possibly store one of these in your garage. But keep in mind, you don't want that freezing and busting the water tank. And sort of along the same lines as these storage tanks is rain catchment. You can buy a 55-gallon drum, hook it up to your gutter system, and if you get enough rain, that may be an option for you. That water would need to be filtered and cleaned out because it's running off of your roof and your shingles and everything. But it would be a good solution, and it could even be used as gray water for flushing toilets. Gray water is basically water that is not necessarily safe to consume. And another emergency option you may have heard about is filling your bathtub with water, although you're going to need a little bit of advance notice for something like this. And I wouldn't necessarily think about the water in the bathtub as drinking water because you just don't know what's inside that bathtub as far as shampoos and soaps and chemicals and things like that. But there's also products like the Water Bob, which is a plastic bag that fits in your bathtub that you can fill up. Again, you would need advance notice for this, say a hurricane or something of that nature, but something like that would be an option, and that would give you around 100 gallons of water. So before we get into the longer term or the more unlimited water supply methods, I want to talk about treating water. And if you are on city water, there's really no reason to put the water treatment in that because it comes from wherever it's coming from already pre-treated and cleaned. So there's really no reason to. As far as well water and water that you might find in other places, that's where you would need to pre-treat that water. And there are a few different methods. You've got bleach, which I believe is about 1/8 of a teaspoon, which is about 7 to 10 drops. You've also got the water treatment solutions, which are part A and part B. And with these solutions, you just mix in 7 drops of part A to 7 drops of part B per liter of water. What I did with my 5-gallon jugs was I mixed a teaspoon of each together, let that activate by itself before I mixed it in the water, and then I filled up those 5-gallon jugs. And with them treated like this, these will last up to 5 years. And when I say last up to 5 years, water doesn't necessarily go bad, right? Water is not going to expire. All the water on the planet, whether it's dirty or clean, eventually will become clean again. So water doesn't necessarily expire, but it does go stale, and it can grow things, microorganisms in the water. And that's why you would need to keep it out of the sunlight and keep it at as even a temperature as you possibly can to prolong the quote unquote shelf life of water. The CDC, I believe they recommend rotating water every 6 months. I'm not so sure about that because we've had water in 2-liter water bottles and things like that for, close to 2 years. And while it does get a little flat or stale tasting, it's still water. And as long as there's nothing growing in it, it's still going to be fine for you. And while I'm on this topic, a question I hear all the time is pool water safe to drink? And the answer isn't really that easy. If the pool has been maintained, the pool water is going to be fine as long as the chlorine level is between 1 and 3 parts per million. As long as there's not too much chlorine. The problem with pool water is if you're talking about a longer term type situation, the longer things go on, that chlorine, like I said, it dissipates. So the longer it goes on, the dirtier that water is going to be, and the more things that are going to be growing in that water because it's not treated. So while you can drink pool water, I suppose, as long as it's perfectly maintained, I would take some precautions if I were in that situation. And like I said, the longer things have gone on, the longer that pool has not been treated, the worse that water is going to be. Okay, so let's get into the larger solutions, what I've been trying to do with my situation being on a well, and even if you are on city water, something you might be able to do as well. Like I said earlier, with my well, once the power goes out, my well is not working anymore. So I've been trying to figure out a solution to get access to that water, the unlimited supply of water that is sitting under my house. And the first solution I thought about was putting a transfer switch in at the breaker box, which basically a transfer switch it switches from the energy that you get from the power grid to the energy that you could get from if you have a generator or even a battery bank, something that could power just a couple breakers in your home. For me, that would be the well pump and the heater, which is a gas heater, but it needs electric to start, and then a couple outlets in the house. But during this process, I called an electrician because this is not something that I am comfortable and that most people are comfortable doing on their own because I don't feel like blowing up my house. But the estimate I got was around $3,500, and that is just a little bit too much for me. So the other option, which I was talking to a friend, Jammer, about this and made his ears bleed as many questions as I had. And he mentioned putting in an interlock, which is something that a lot of people can do. I'm not so sure I feel comfortable with it yet, but a lot of people can do that. And an interlock is basically the same thing as a transfer switch, other than it's just a plate that you put on your fuse box and a breaker for your power supply. And when you turn on the power from your generator or your external source, it cuts off the power from the grid. So it's basically just a plate you put on that won't allow you to have both breakers on at the same time. And that is what my plans are now. That is the goal, to get that put in. Until I do that, though, I want to make sure I have some water in case of an emergency. And like I said earlier, I purchased some 5-gallon water jugs, about 100 gallons worth. I sell these over at the shtfshop.com. You can get them at Legacy Foods, and there are all sorts of different water containers that you can get on Amazon as well. But I figured with 100 gallons or so, that is going to last me a few days. For a lot of people, it would be longer than that. but we have 2 horses, which use 5 gallons of water a day. And then we've got the 2 of us here, and it could possibly be more with the children. So we're looking at probably 10 gallons of water per day usage. So while 100 gallons may seem like a lot, and it could be a lot for you, for us, it's only, a week, maybe 2 weeks. I've also got the pond outside, which is about 350 gallons, and that would be used for the animals. Now, I do have a UV filter on this pond, and the waterfall itself is a filter, but it's not a filter that's going to get any of the microorganisms out. It just gets the big junk out. All in all, I've got about 400, maybe 450 gallons of water stored. And with that amount of water, that will get us through most disaster scenarios, emergency situations that I can think of. It's still not good enough for me, though. I have the ability, I have all of this water sitting under my house, and I want the ability to be able to get that water into my house. If you are on city water, you could do the same type of thing. It really depends on the power situation at the pumping station and whether that water is going to be able to get into your home in the first place, even if you do have power. But you could do the same thing. Just do some research on your home, your area, and how that would work. But those could be options as well. And that interlock or that transfer switch are a good idea, even if you're just talking about electricity, because it's a lot easier to be able to go out into the garage and turn that switch and have power into the living room, the kitchen, or wherever, than running extension cords in or pulling out battery banks and doing things like that. So one of those, it's a large investment, but if it is something that's right for you, you could do that. If you do have some decent knowledge about electronics and breaker boxes and all of those things, you could put that interlock in fairly easily and much less expensive than it would be to put in a transfer switch. But it would give you a lot of peace of mind knowing that even if it's just a short-term power outage, all you have to do is flip a switch and you are good to go. So as I said earlier in the video, water storage is both the easiest part and maybe the hardest part of preparedness as well, because you've got to figure out where you're going to store all that water or what your different solutions are. I tried to cover basically everything in this video, and I'm sure there's so much to it that I'm sure I forgot a few things. And the preparedness community is great about different ideas for finding water and doing different things to procure water. If you've got any ideas, any thoughts, make sure and leave them in the comments below. But that is it for today, everyone. Take care and prepare. We will talk to you all later.